Bueno, buenas tardes a todos. Lugares, también pusieron televisión, ¿tú sabes?
Sí, sí.
¿Sí? ¿En el otro salón? Sí. Okay. Bueno, well, I just want to welcome Professor Ian Hacking. As you all know, and, Professor Hacking is one of the most important, most distinguished philosophers of science, historians of science, and we are very happy to have you here, Professor. As you can see, there is a lot of interest in what you are going to say. And I want to thank especially Sergio Martinez for organizing this visit. And well, I will say no more, just welcome, and I hope that this visit will be fruitful not only for us but also for you. Thank you very much.
Just one announcement before Professor talking starts. The lectures that Professor Hacking will be giving here will be available en internet. Las conferencias van a estar disponibles en internet en esa dirección y junto con otros trabajos de Hacking sobre el tema. So,
the handout should go around.
the handout, most people have a handouts. Oh, that is.
I am going to standing up. Well, thank you very much, both my immediate hosts, for all your hospitality. It is, for me, a joy to be in Mexico, and also to have the opportunity to develop an idea which I've been thinking about for 30 years or so. My last set of public lectures, 3 public lectures on this topic, was given in Taiwan and published as a little book early last year. Professor Martinez has made these available in PDF form also on this site. Though the Taiwan lectures are copyright, and they will be taken off the site soon after the lectures finish. These will be there as long as the internet lasts, or something. I'm very grateful anyway to Sergio for that and many other kindnesses. I hope that the version of the lecture, this lecture today, now, which will be on the internet, will be 30% longer than what I am talking. I will talk for about an hour, but the lecture on the internet will be longer. I hope there will be ample critical discussion of what follows, both after each of the 3 talks and on a specially scheduled discussion section following them. Today, I'm just going to recapitulate material from the Taiwan lectures, mention some revisions, suggest some supplementary ideas, and indicate how I want to advance. Although those lectures sketched some 6 styles of scientific thinking and doing, it discussed only 3 of these in any detail: mathematics, experimental exploration, and hypothetical modeling. Plus, what I urged was the fundamental transition to modern science, the laboratory style. Next week, I shall expand the theory to probability, statistics, taxonomy, and the mode of reasoning that was prefigured by the almost universal myths of the creation of the universe of man, and which culminated in the origin of the species. Thus, the Taiwan lectures are not about life. My last lecture will be all about life. You could see those lectures as a footnote to a remark by Einstein in a letter. He wrote, "Development of Western science is based on 2 great achievements: the invention of the formal logical system in Euclidean geometry by the Greek geometers, Greek philosophers, he said, and the discovery of the possibility to find out causal relationships by systematic experiment during the Renaissance. In my opinion, one has not to be astonished that the Chinese sages have not made these steps. The astonishing thing is that those discoveries were made at all. And they were not discoveries of facts about the world, but discoveries about how to find out. Kant was struck by the same thing. He wrote, "In the earliest times to which the history of reason extends, mathematics, among that wonderful people, the Greeks, had already entered upon the sure path of science. The transformation must have been due to a revolution," and he italicized that word. Natural science was very much longer in entering upon the highway of science. In this case also, the discovery can be explained as being the sudden outcome of an intellectual revolution. Kant and Einstein used different words for these events. One says achievement and astonishing. The other says sudden outcome and revolution. They describe two signal discoveries differently, but they are pointing at the same two very local events. One in ancient Greece and the other late in the Renaissance or early modern period. But both men saw clearly that these two events marked radical innovations in human life. Both saw we had to find out how to find out. Neither man was a historian or sociologist of science, so they were able to see right off what is invisible to or beyond the scope of most historians and sociologists. Then my next heading, and these are all in the lecture handout, so you can sort of, if you get lost or go to sleep or something, you can wake up and find the heading. Read out this heading. What am I doing? 5 gestures towards an answer. I am often classified as a philosopher of science, including today. I think of myself as a philosopher, although one who tries to keep up with a number of sciences. But I prefer to show what I am doing by doing it. However, it may be useful to begin with some labels. These serve as pointers, not names of clear and distinct ideas. My rough and ready list of 5 imposing nouns is genealogy, history of the present, innate human capacities, cognitive history, and anthropology. First, a word on the sciences. I would like to say, but I can't really, that the sciences are those activities by which, in our civilization, we find out about the world and ourselves. But that just won't do. We find out about ourselves by falling in love and by our resilience, or not, in the face of adversity. We find out about human nature by reading good novels. We find out lots about the world by keeping our eyes open on a long walk. In fact, what we call the sciences are the activities in which we found out using an assortment of particular methods. And it's precisely those methods that interest us when we try to define the sciences. So we start to think in a circle, but it's not vicious. It reminds us only that we shouldn't aim at a definition of science. We should take what we call the sciences as given. Within them we draw a by no means clear distinction between the natural and the human sciences, marked in different ways in different languages and cultures. I draw no boundaries, but in these lectures I have in view what are called the natural sciences, the life sciences, and mathematics. They include, more carefully, medicine, cognitive psychology, positive sociology, and other disciplines, but not, for example, history. The contingency of our conception of science. Why do we just have to point at science to say what it is? Partly because the very idea of science is very contingent. I don't say its definition is a matter of convention, but I do say that what counts as science is partly the result of institutional codifications of interconnected practices and bodies of knowledge enshrined in systems of education and rites of passage, enshrined in the geography of this campus, for example. Recall that the scholastics had 7 liberal arts. Of these, the trivium consisted of grammar, rhetoric, and logic. The quadrivium was arithmetic, quartet, arithmetic, geometry, music, or the theory of harmony, and astronomy or cosmology. We find this is an odd group of 4, to say the least. But in early medieval times, the quadrivium could be seen as right and is inevitable a way of sorting knowledge, as does our modern notion of science. There is one fundamental difference between the early medieval view and ours. Knowledge was once conceived of as a fundamentally fixed body of truth, and men were praised for their mastery of it. Early in the 19th century, we began to think of the sciences as growing bodies of truths. The non-scientist was coined at that time in order to characterize workers engaged in discovery. It's the cockcrow of the positive age that we still inhabit. By the end of the century, the Nobel Prizes had been established as the supreme reward for finding out something really and truly new, or finding out how to measure something whose measurement had never been possible before. So I am occupied not with what we have found out, as a medieval scholastic might be, or with what we're finding out right now, which a sociologist would be interested in, but with how, over time, we found out how to find out in ways that we call scientific. We had to discover or invent them. And I'm interested in the most general types of ways that are still used in scientific practice, and which have been around for a long time. My most radical claim is that these ways of finding out come with their own criteria for truth, evidence, explanation, and other scientific goodies. That is, they do not answer to some pre-existing criteria of objectivity, but are our criteria for objective knowledge. Genealogy. Philosophers, historians, and sociologists of the sciences study how we find out, what we have found out, whether or to what extent we have found out anything at all. These talks draw on all those types of inquiry, but have a focus different from any. I am concerned with how we found out how to find out, and this is a genealogy, then, of scientific reason. The word is only a signpost. We owe the metaphor of genealogy to Nietzsche. My immediate predecessors are Michel Foucault and Bernard Williams, both of whom emphasized how much they owe to him. Williams used his genealogy to vindicate truth. I don't want to vindicate scientific reason or anything else. Foucault's genealogies were intended as elements of struggle against existing regimes of truth, as he called them. He aimed in part at unmasking what we think of as inevitable ways of organizing intellectual and social practices. I don't want to unmask anything. My aims are thus, in some ways, more modest than those of Nietzsche, Foucault, or Bernard Williams, though I learned from all three. History of the present. My genealogy is, as the French historians say, in the longue durée. I'm concerned with general methods of engaging in scientific work that can be recognized in ancient times, which solidified over the course of centuries, and which continue to be practiced in more than full vigor today. It's a story of how we got to here. Now, my ways of classifying past practices conform to contemporary classifications. That's anachronistic. I can dress it up in trendy garb, copied from Foucault, and say I'm doing history of the present. I am content to mark out methods of reasoning according to our present ways of thinking. That's a bad way to do history, but it may be a useful way to begin philosophizing so long as one is aware of what one is doing. Innate human capacities. Scientific practices rely on human capacities that have been honed during millennia of people asking questions and trying to make the world more to their liking. For a very weak analogy, think of the ways in which the amazing feats of Olympic swimming or high jumping rely on the intense cultivation of innate capacities. In the case of sports, we selected certain body shapes best suited for achievement. In the sciences, we select and train certain innate qualities of mind and body, including inventiveness and manual dexterity. The language faculty is one power, essential to science, to which much thought has been given ever since the great set questions of 18th century academies about the origin of language. It's accepted that something happened in the biological evolution of our species that made human language possible. But, as Noam Chomsky is the first to insist, we have not got much past the stage of telling just so stories. It's a truism that the various styles of scientific thinking and doing make use of distinct innate human capacities, but we have very little idea of the evolutionary history of those capacities. I hope that someday we will be able to distinguish the innate, that is, heritable products of prehistorical events, from what was acquired in human history. Cognitive history. A genealogy of scientific reason wants a cognitive history. I owe this label to the historian of ancient mathematics, Reveal Netz. I mean the history of events at specific times and places during which human beings discovered how to exploit some cognitive capacities. Netz suggests that cognitive histories should be thought of as part of ecological history, a history of how a biological organism, the human body, with its brain, developed certain relationships with its environment. His book on Greek mathematics analyzes the radical change that culminated at the time of Eudoxus of Cnidus. That's 408 BC or something. That same radical change which Einstein called astonishing and which Kant called a sudden moment and revolution. It was then and there that human beings first discovered their capacity for making mathematical demonstrations. And that's my first example of finding out how to find out. Anthropology. There was plenty of what we can recognize as mathematics before the time of Eudoxus, but there was nothing we can recognize as a mathematical proof. Its discovery was an event in the history of the Eastern Mediterranean. It was stabilized by the interactions involving an intimate group of disciples and correspondents in that region. Other styles of thinking and doing, to which I shall turn, crystallized much later. Hypothetical modeling did not fully come into its own before the time of Galileo, that second revolution of Kant's, that second achievement of Einstein's. The cognitive history of various types of scientific reason will invariably be local in nature, about a specific time and place, datable, pointable to on a map. But it will indicate catastrophic blips in the biologically tranquil history of the species. It happens that these blips took place in what we have reconstructed as a not very continuous history of thought from ancient Greece to here. More important than blips is the possibility of universal uptake. What starts at a unique place and time can, precisely because it is grounded in universal human traits and capacities, be done anywhere, at any time, that material conditions are favorable. Scientific reason is the property of all mankind. Eudoxus and Galileo may have thrived near the shores of the Mediterranean, but what they mastered is nowadays as easily practiced in Shenzhen, Bangalore, Mexico City, as it is in Paris or Stanford. Scientific thinking and doing emerged locally, but it's universal. Hence our topic falls under anthropology, meaning not the study of particular peoples, but the study of humans and their doings in general. It falls under what Kant called anthropology from a practical point of view. He contrasted that with anthropology from a physical point of view, study of the body. But we must never forget that scientific reason depends on physiological, that is, neurological processes, so a full understanding of our subject would be both practical and physical. Part B, styles of scientific thinking and doing, some background. I start with alien anthropology. A Martian anthropologist directed to the practice of what we call science might distinguish several distinct types of activity, not just manual activity, but ways of proceeding, methods. He might even report it looks as if there are different guilds or castes for those deemed proficient, most proficient at each method. There are mathematicians, there are experimenters, there are theoreticians, there are statisticians, there are classifiers. Now these are by no means mutually exclusive. Newton, to take an exceptional example, was a great experimenter, a great theorist, and a great mathematician. But they do tend to involve different talents and different training. Members of the several guilds tend to think and work in different ways, address different types of problem, and have different sorts of insights. Happily, they collaborate. Crombie's template. The historian of science, Alistair Crombie, built on a trifling observation rather like that of my imagined Martian. He distinguished 6 what he called styles of scientific thinking in the European tradition. Short names for his styles are mathematical, experimental exploration, hypothetical modeling, probability and statistics, taxonomic, historical derivation of genetic development. Although he distinguished 6 styles, he was quite clear that in real life and in history, they are constantly interweaving. His styles are not sciences, but methods that may be deployed in any science. Crombie took the long view of a civilization taken from within its own Western story of an extended past. Historians of science have no more use for this approach than historians have for the grand schemes of a Spengler or a Toynbee. Sociologists of science regard it as antiquated twaddle. Hence, Crombie turns out to be of interest only from the grand view, the one that philosophers have the hubris to take upon themselves. 2 groups of styles. Crombie thought his 6 styles of scientific reasoning fall into 2 groups. He wrote that the first 3 concern essentially the science of individual regularities, the second 3 the science of the regularities of populations ordered in space and time. My Taiwan lectures were about the first group. Next week's talks are about the second. It's handy to abbreviate the last of the 6 styles, that cumbersome historical derivation of genetic development. Call it historico-genetic, or just HG for short. It's for the 3rd lecture, and it may be anomalous from the point of view of my analysis. It did not show up in the Martian classification. It's quite easy to recognize. It seems to grow out of a universal tendency for creation myths that tell how the universe came into being and tell how life, with special emphasis on human beings, came to be. We need go no further than the book of Genesis, or better still, visit the Anthropology Museum here in Mexico City. There, yesterday, I was looking at equally wonderful stories of origin told by the Maya, the Mexica, and many others. These myths explain or make sense of the world about us by telling a story of how the present arose from the past, right back to the beginning. They're not answers to why questions, but to how did we get here questions. We transform the myths into science when the historical derivation is grounded on very general causal propositions about the world and not on mere chronological sequences. Our present scientific answers for the universe and for humanity are respectively the Big Bang theory and evolution by natural selection. We may come to decide in the course of the third lecture that historico-genetic reason has run its course from myths to sometime in the recent past, and that we no longer need it. Big Bang and evolution are sound, it could be argued, precisely because they rely on a mix of 5 other styles and not of the fantasies of historical derivation. The word style. I have retained Crombie's word style despite its wide use in so many domains. I'm not even going to defend that choice here. If you like, I'm simply stuck with the word because I've used it since I heard Crombie propose his theory in 1978. But I'm changing the terminology slightly because he presented it as all about the mind, styles of thinking. Science, all sciences and all styles of scientific work involve doing as much as thinking. So I now refer to styles of scientific thinking and doing. And because when I've written about this in the past, people have taken up my phrases and used them in their own ways, which are very useful, but not mine. I prefer to put a trademark in it. I now always write the and, thinking and doing, with an ampersand. You can't steal it. It has to be somebody else's. They say the same words, but don't write an ampersand. I'm happy to have somebody steal it, but it better be my idea. My idea out there, not somebody else's. One idea I like. Ludwig Fleck's thought style. The popularity of the word style took off in Germany during the first third of the 20th century. I can mention Heinrich Wöfflin, who used it to change art history. Oswald Spengler in his tale of the War of Civilizations. Karl Mannheim rewriting sociology. Not to mention the Nazis who castigated the Jewish thought style. I have found it convenient, since the Taiwan lectures, to extract just one usage from this potpourri, Ludwig Fleck's thought style, published in 1935. He subtitled his book, Introduction to the Theory of the Thought Style and the Thought Collective. Thought style and thought collective go hand in hand. A thought collective is a small network of investigators who address a family of problems they understand in much the same way, in which they attack using a group of mutually intelligible methods. Fleck's thought styles were constituted by the types of questions asked, the range of possible answers envisaged, and above all, the methods which were useful, and the background information taken for granted. Thought collectives are local, cohesive, relatively short-lived. They dissipate as questions become answered or problems prove to be intractable. In the former case, they become the common denominator of a far larger scientific community, and in the latter case, they become obsolete. Thomas Kuhn says at the beginning of his famous structure that he was much aided in the development of his thought by his reference to Ludwig Fleck's book. And in fact, as you may know, he used the word, his favored word, paradigm, in a number of ways, and he wasn't clear about it. I respect the work enormously. He himself said, I have to clarify this after being questioned. I mean, a colleague or a teacher or something of mine, Margaret Masterman, wrote a paper distinguishing 22 senses of thought, of paradigm in structure, and Kuhn took it seriously. He took all criticism very seriously. And he produced two names, one for what was meant by paradigm. One was a matrix of 100 or so disciplinary workers in the same discipline, he called it disciplinary matrix, and the other was the paradigm as achievement, which served as a model for others. The matrix is identical with the thought collective in Fleck's style, and I think Fleck's term is much clearer than Kuhn's terminology. They're both framework concepts. Paradigms and thought style collectives are framework concepts. They concern what questions make sense, which ways of answering them are on the table. They have to do with what is thinkable as well as what is thought. All framework concepts descend from Kant. Framework concepts of a generation or two include paradigm, Michel Foucault's episteme, Nicolas Jardin's questions, maybe Gerald Horton's themata, even Imre Lakatosh's research programs are rather frameworky. The underlying assumption of hermeneutics is of an underlying conceptual framework that must be broken through to understand the other. Incommensurability, which kept philosophers of science busy 1960-1980, is a framework concept. Framework concepts invite the fantasy of a closed system that forms the very structure of all thought in its domain. But nothing, of course, is closed. Kant's frameworks collapsed with relativity, quantum theory, causality, and the rest, and non-Euclidean geometry. One can be completely skeptical about all framework concepts, and certainly all framework theorists should have Popper's essay, The Myth of the Framework, to hand. But with some sensitivity, they are still a powerful way of thinking that we owe to Kant. I call the next section Fleck and Me. Thought styles and styles of thinking and doing can be regarded as opposite ends of a spectrum. The thought style is entirely local in both space-time and content. It is short-lived and a characteristic of a short-lived thought collective. That in turn is an entity that can be defined by conventional sociological tools. Crombie's styles, adapted to my philosophical ends, are the common property of mankind, not of a little collective. They evolve. They are cumulative. There are innumerable social histories to be told of their use over the decades and centuries. A social history must be invoked to explain the origin of each of Crombie's styles. More importantly, sociology is needed to explain their continuation, expansion, and revitalization. Each such event is the work of this or that collective. But there is no collective associated with our styles of thinking and doing unless it be the human race. The study of scientific reason is part of anthropology, not sociology. But styles need thought collectives. A style of scientific thinking and doing begins with a thought collective at a time and place. There was a gang of disciples, colleagues, and correspondents around the time of Eudoxus. In the beginning, they had a totally idiosyncratic thought style, one which, on my shorthand account, involved the discovery of a human capacity. We would like to have a social history of that and also of the uptake that followed. The community in Greece was almost always very small all around the Mediterranean, even though the impact of popularized mathematics partly popularized by Plato, was substantial. It's very different in the modern period. There's no better example of a thought collective, with subsidiary collectives and overlapping ones, than the very early Royal Society of London. It was there that what I call the laboratory style of thinking and doing began to flourish, and at that time. Stephen Shapin and Simon Schaffer's Leviathan and the Air Pump has become a classic of science studies, and it reports the sociology of the thought collective from which the laboratory style grew. I now pass to part C, styles of scientific thinking and doing, a sketch of some outrageous philosophizing. Methods and objects. There are fundamental differences between styles. To start with, they're distinguished by their methods and their objects. Now, few would protest if I said a style introduces new methods of inquiry. I might even say a style just is a new method of inquiry. But a style also brings new types of objects under consideration. And that requires more care. Long ago, the then famous and powerful British physicist, Arthur Eddington, made a shocking statement in a public lecture under the title, The Nature of the Physical World. It was 1928. He said there were two tables before him, the one made of wood, whatever this one's made of, I can't see, and the one made of molecules, and their properties were very different. I wish I had the chutzpah to say that, I don't, but I lean on his idea. The table is a familiar object. The molecules are unobservable theoretical entities. Eddington was quite confident about the molecules. In his day and ours, there were skeptics about theoretical entities, instrumentalists who thought the molecule was an intellectual or logical construction used to make sense of empirical data. Auguste Comte, the founder of positivism, had a version of that doctrine, as does Bas van Frossen today. It is now common to put variants of this skepticism under the heading of anti-realism and to file Eddington as a realist. But here I emphasize the new type of theoretical object. Not the molecules, but the type, the theoretical entity. A new type of object brought to the fore by hypothetical modeling is the unobservable theoretical entity, of which the molecule is an instance. The mathematical style introduces us to abstract objects, of which numbers and circles are examples. People were aware of circles before mathematics. They had invented the wheel. But the idea of the perfect ideal circle laid up in the world of Platonic ideas arises only as geometric proof comes into being. Notoriously, we have a famous realism-anti-realism disputation in that realm too, often caricatured as a Platonism. It doesn't have much relation to Plato, actually, but called Platonism in mathematics. Less momentous ontological disputations arise from other styles. The statistical style generates statistical objects, such as the mean, exemplified in the first instance by the average man. I am tempted to think of probability in the frequency usage as being a new statistical object introduced early in the 17th century, solidified only in the 19th. One type of object arising in the taxonomic style at the time of Linnaeus is exemplified by the taxa and an absolute hierarchy of ranks, beginning with ranks and going up to beginning with species and going up to kingdoms. It's striking that many of Crombie's styles are associated with realism, anti-realism disputes about their objects. Thus I begin the section called Ontological Disputation. Unobservable theoretical entities, abstract objects of mathematics. Do the species, and especially the higher taxa such as genera, families, classes, and orders, really exist? Or are they just conveniences for we who classify? Are the mean and variance of a population mere summaries of data, or are there laws of nature that irreducibly involve these quantities? I used to say that each style introduces a new type of object, but ancient philosophical disputation made many people find that also not only unpalatable, but also monstrous or absurd. Platonists about mathematics maintain abstract objects such as numbers with their properties exist out of time and space. Hence they could not possibly be introduced by the mathematical style, for they were always there. One theme of the Taiwan lectures, I shall not now elaborate, is that the theory of scientific reason tends to undermine realism, anti-realism controversies. They're just a byproduct of the introduction of the styles. And I call them disputations to remind us how scholastic they are. They really don't matter to scientists, although scientists have philosophical views. But a Platonist and a constructionist about mathematics can understand each other perfectly well. It is true that the constructionist will call in question some proofs that the Platonist does not, and that is an interesting topic too. But that basically the disputations are byproducts of the emergence of a scientific style. Now, this observation is intended to undermine the disputes, not to resolve them. I think I came to overemphasize the novelty of types of objects just because they have entered so strongly into the ontological disputations in which philosophers have entangled themselves. I actually hit a better balance in my 1992 paper on style, where I listed a great many new novelties, including new types of object, evidence, sentence, new ways of being a candidate for truth or falsehood, law, or at any rate, modalities, possibility, explanation. These various types of novelty, other than types of objects, will play a serious role in lectures 2 and 3. Continuity. Crombie's analysis was continualist, tracing each style from ancient Greece to at least mid-19th century Europe. That invites the contempt of most practitioners in science studies. Well, I am not properly reformed. I take continualism in my stride, so long as I am allowed my mutations and catastrophes. I shall next embrace discontinuity, but first let us record that every style has its own bumpy but sort of continuous trajectory. Moreover, there can be splitting and merging. Thus, parallel to Kant's finding distinct sources for geometrical and arithmetical knowledge, one in space and one in time, we are tempted to distinguish two distinct substyles of mathematical reasoning, geometrical and combinatorial. They probably rely on different innate capacities. A major school of cognitive science maintains we have one domain-specific cognitive module for brain and another for space, and they're quite probably located in different parts of the head. Certainly the two have distinct histories. The Greeks were dominated by geometry, while Persia, Islam, and India were algebraic. The amazing fact is that during the late Renaissance and early modern period, we learned to do algebra geometrically and geometry algebraically. That is one reason that we so confidently take for granted there is just one thing, mathematics. A synthesis of experimental exploration and hypothetical modeling led to what I call the laboratory style. It grew out of a number of simultaneous European thought collectives, of which Boyle and his Royal Society of London have been the most studied. The laboratory style, with its systematic use of apparatus to elicit new phenomena, was the most fundamental innovation of the scientific revolution. Perhaps the advent of fast computation is engendering a new style of scientific thinking and doing, namely simulation. It may in the future be seen as a wholly new way of finding out, and not merely as what it appears at first to be, namely a rapid working out of the consequences of hypothetical models. Many of my younger colleagues and students see it that way right now. Discontinuity. Some scholars are like Crombie. When they see continuities, there is hardly space enough for radical breaks. Some are the opposite. When they see mutations, there is no continuity, period. I am eclectic. The historical side of my mind was formed by reading Gaston Bachelard, Thomas Kuhn, and above all, Michel Foucault. They had a litany of metaphors, starting with Kant's revolutions, epistemological breaks, coupure, mutations, and the like. I add one more. I call a sharp break within a continuity a crystallization. Some of you will know that the mutation upon which I cut my teeth was written up in The Emergency of Probability 35 years ago. I said probability began around 1650. Lots of very well-informed critics rallied round and proved there were endless probability ideas in circulation centuries or millennia before then. So now I can make peace. Okay, there is a line of probability ideas traced by Crombie himself going back to ancient Greece. Nevertheless, they came together in a whole new configuration of possibilities not thinkable before. The emergence of modern probability is an example of a crystallization in a style of thinking. According to every tradition and every scholar, it happened at the time of Pascal. The main difference between me and some others is that I argue this event was catastrophic and changed everything in a short period of time, about 1650. Crystallization and emblematic trailblazers. There is a curious fact about popular histories of science, storybooks for children. I shall try not to exaggerate this fact, the significance of this fact, because few people share my taste in folklore and legend and respect for it. But in my heart, I believe it is an important aspect of the canonical styles. Each style tends to be associated with a hero in history. There was Pascal, although, as I insisted in a whole book, Emergence, probability emerged all over Europe in the same short span of time and in most of its modern guises as well. Pascal didn't do it, but Pascal is the emblem of what happened in popular history. Sometimes the heroes are not much more than myth. In the case of mathematics, it was Thales. I revel in one of Kant's great supplements to the First Critique. I quoted the entire passage in the Taiwan lectures, but a sentence will suffice. A new light flashed upon the mind of the first man, be he Thales or some other, who demonstrated the properties of the isosceles triangle. Now, of course, there was no first man. There was a first community, a thought collective. The trailblazer whom I might now choose for the discovery of proof is Eudoxus. But it is the quasi-mythical Thales who still serves as the emblem of this discovery. I find it remarkable that from earliest times the Greeks wanted an emblem. The emblem of the hypothetico-deductive modeling is, of course, Galileo. He is agreed on by all, including such by now legends in their own right as Edmund Husserl and Alexander Koyle. Taxonomy had its Linnaeus. I shall discuss in the third lecture whether we should count Charles Darwin as the emblem of the first successful crystallization of the historico-genetic style. And aside on logic, is it a style of scientific reasoning? In a word, no. I follow Charles Sanders Peirce and others and think of three or perhaps four types of logic: deduction, induction, abduction, classification. I follow old traditions and regard these as pre-scientific. I can see why the scholastics put them into the trivium, which came before the special sciences, the quadrivium. I cautiously welcome the cognitive scientists who teach that we have innate modules for each one of these. Each one of the four: abduction, deduction, induction, and classification. Mathematical style builds on deduction. Experimental style builds on induction. Hypothetical modeling builds on abduction. The taxonomic style builds on classification. These are prior logical instincts, many of which we may share with other primates and other organisms. Karl Popper scornfully said that amoeba make inductions, which showed how worthless inductions were. Long live the amoeba, they did live long. Logic in its four forms is a precondition for styles of scientific thinking and doing. You may have noticed that I did not propose a crystallization or legendary trailblazer for the style of experimental exploration. Kant did. He proposed Galileo, Torricelli, and the chemist Georg M. Stahl. But he adds in a footnote in the B version I am not, in my choice of examples, tracing the exact course of the experimental method. We have indeed no very precise knowledge of its beginnings. I distinguish the experimental method from hypothetical modeling in a way Kant did not, and I would say that the method of experimental exploration is as much part of our animal nature as logic itself. It had no beginning, or rather we began by using it. The radical event in its history was the combination with hypothetical modeling to generate something far more specific, the laboratory style. That crystallization, I say, occurred around the time of Boyle, but if you want to pass it back in time to Torricelli, it's fine with me. Learning from Bernard Williams. His book, Truth and Truthfulness of 2002, helped me. He wrote of telling the truth about historical events. The writing of history does not count as a style of scientific thinking, but his analysis can be adapted. He took Thucydides as an emblem of a radical change in the Western conception of history. Maybe I got the idea of emblem from him. No. I emphasize two statements. According to Williams, there was, first, a shift in conception of what it is to tell the truth about the past, and second, this significant change took place in the 5th century BC, and its emblem is Thucydides. I propose to generalize that schema to almost all of the canonical styles. For example, a shift in conceptions of what it is to tell the truth about geometrical shapes took place in the 6th century BC, and its legendary emblem is Thales, or to be more historical, Eudoxus in the 4th. The shift in conception was that telling the truth in this domain meant being able to prove what was asserted. There had been ample geometrical thinking long before proofs were created, understood, and ritualized, but now there arose a new way to tell the truth and a class of abstract objects that those truths appeared to be about. I could carry on in this vein for all the styles, but something is wrong. I can repair the blunder by using the recent jargon of analytic philosophers. Proof is a way to establish truth, but it's not the criterion of truth. Mathematical demonstration is a criterion of assertability in mathematics. So we modify the schema and say that in the time of Eudoxus, there was a shift in conceptions about the assertability of mathematical propositions. And there are more shifts than in conceptions of truth. There was a shift in conception of probability at the time of Pascal, but it would be poorly expressed as a change in conceptions in how to tell the truth about probabilities. Insofar as probability statements are statements about the credibility of other propositions, they can be better or worse founded on available evidence, but they are not immediately thought of as true or false at all. So there's a shift in conceptions, but not well expressed by a rote variation on Williams' schema. We will do something more subtle next week. Likewise, classificatory statements and their more systematic version, their more sophisticated version in systematic taxonomy, may be correct or incorrect, better or worse. They are not naturally called true or false. The radical shift in conceptions of biological classification occurred when we passed from the world of Aristotle and the scholastics. Genus and species used to be merely relative terms. After Linnaeus, they became part of an absolute hierarchy of ranks. That was the shift in conception which was fundamental to the crystallization. Next week, I turn to these things. Self-authentication. Williams' schema remains a useful starting blueprint, but we have to extend it from truth to a gamut of related philosophically charged concepts ranging from assertability to explanation. Williams is useful because he is so radical, more so than he intended perhaps. To use his example, in which the topic is history and the trailblazer is Thucydides, we are not to think of Thucydides finding out how to tell the truth about history better than Herodotus did, but of introducing new criteria of what it is to tell the truth about the past. For starters, every historical event occurs before after, or overlapping in time with every other historical event. This criterion does not answer to some pre-existing canon for the truth of historical statements. It comes into being with what Williams calls history itself. The theory of scientific styles generalizes this ideal. Each style is in part constituted by its own criteria for telling the truth about objects in its domain, or providing explanations, or even laws of nature. These criteria involve the methods peculiar to the style. They are, in that sense, self-authenticating. They do not answer to any standard of truth or explanation or assertability except their own. They become canonical for what we now call objective knowledge. This brings out the way in which the concept of a style of scientific thinking and doing is a framework concept. None of this implies a style cannot be challenged or abandoned, only that it cannot be directly refuted by showing it establishes falsehoods. Imagine that in the late 1960s, the Cultural Revolution in China and the anti-war movement in the United States jointly produced such a rage against science that we stopped scientific activity cold. You may recall that we're here right now because of that scientific rage, that rage against reason that expressed itself among Mexican students in the same period of time. Crombie's first three styles have proven to be remarkably stable. The second three are more problematic. We shall see the statistical style in one of its aspects seems only too self-sealing. The taxonomic style may not be stable at all, or it became so only after Darwin taught us that all true classification is genealogical, I quote him. The historical genetic style may not yet have achieved full stability, or perhaps, as I suggested, it has become obsolete. These are topics for next week. My interim conclusion. I hope I have begun to interest you in this study. I prefer you to think it absurd rather than dull. The project for scientific reason is both out of date and at the same time radical in intention. It is out of date in that it does not denounce Crombie's continualism. Worse, it uses the children's heroes in history, but only as handy emblems, because they do point at something simple and right beneath the awful complexity of real history. The doctrine of self-authentication is reminiscent of Moritz Schlick's aphorism, the meaning of a statement is its method of verification. The project favors the dissolution of ontological disputations in ways that recall Nietzsche. Our war horses are then jaded. Our aim is to reuse them, to re-understand the role of scientific reason, the character of scientific knowledge, and what is traditionally called the nature of truth in the sciences. The project is a contribution to, using Kant's name but maybe not his meaning, anthropology from a practical point of view. It is a reflection on how humans in history have been able to find out how to find out using their innate capacities. Indirectly, it is a study of what has enabled our species, for better or worse, to dominate our planet, modifying everything about us. This anthropology is Eurocentric, for scientific reason is here described as a product of a Mediterranean and then European history. But since scientific reason is grounded on universal human capacities, this is a universal anthropology in which, from a world historical point of view, the European events are mere punctuation marks. Thank you.
So now we will have some questions. If someone wants to make a question in Spanish, we can, if it is short, we can try to translate, but otherwise.
And I am showing the signs of age. It becomes slightly hard of hearing, and also I may not understand well someone who is speaking very generously English in a Spanish accent. So for one or the other or both reasons, I may have to ask Sergio to repeat a question. Please do not take that as an insult, but as a statement.
Okay, so 1 second, Margarita, and then Enrique. Margarita.
Oh, well, thank you. It was very interesting, your talk. And, but I'd like to make a question. How do you see philosophy within your, the map that you have designed today? I mean, what's the relationship? Do you think that philosophical thinking is some sort of scientific thinking? How is it related with science? And what are we doing, philosophers? I mean, within this map that you presented to us.
Well, I hesitate to characterize philosophy. Am I heard without this, or should I have this? Just in case, because it's harder to understand English for some people. Two questions, really. What am I doing as a philosopher? And two, what is the relationship of philosophy to styles of scientific thinking and doing? What I'm doing, I describe myself as having Leibniz as a role model and being in certain ways a descendant of Kant, but with one important change. Kant wrote before we became historicists, so he really thought he was describing the bounds of pure reason as pure reason ahistorically. I think I'm describing what reason is, namely an historical object. But I self-consciously, when asked, place myself within that philosophical tradition. And of course, I learned from many. I deploy, by and large, my background is that of an analytical philosopher trained in Cambridge in the 1950s. And I think ultimately in that way. That's me. But I just think of it as kind of old-fashioned philosophy done, but philosophy constantly adopts new techniques, approaches. We owe things to so many people. What is the relationship of philosophy to the sciences? Well, there are many things which are worth calling philosophy. In the United States, it is considered a bad joke to call Michel Foucault a philosopher. In France, he is regarded as, by some, as the paramount philosopher of the golden era in Paris in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. Which is the right concept of philosophy? I could not care less. I sometimes say that, this is an autobiographical remark, many of the well-known, I have a few well-known academics who are among my friends. I don't have a big range of acquaintance, but there's a few relatively well-known people whom I count as close friends. They tend to be anthropologists rather than philosophers, which isn't to say I don't get on with philosophers. That's how my mind works. Philosophy seems to be an exceedingly complex family of ideas which we use to carve out some sort of history in the past. And it certainly doesn't have distinctive, it may have local sort of styles of working and so forth. We say that Donald Davidson works in a very different style to J.L. Austin or something, although Davidson played a lot of it. We have lots and lots of local styles, but we don't have this sort of canonical methods of doing philosophy, which is one reason that bureaucrats really have trouble filing philosophers and sometimes considering they should abolish the subject.
Okay. Yeah, there's a question.
So just very briefly, I'd like to ask you, why are you learning history outside the sciences? Because it seems to me there's very, very little difference between sociology and history, for example. So
Between what and history?
Sociology and history. So,
Sociology and history.
Yes.
So,
Look, I have a lot of ambivalence about sociology, and sociology itself clearly divides into a sort of kind of quantitative experimental method, which relies very heavily on the statistical style of thinking and doing. And so that's what a lot of professional sociologists do. There are other sociologists who I would say are much closer to anthropologists They make very general statements about the structure of society. If I want little small legendary figures, I would say that Max Weber is the ideal type, to use his own word, of the latter, and Durkheim, in his early work, and particular Suicide, is the emblem of the statistical type. The statistical type seems to me just a branch of experimental exploration using statistical methods. The other doesn't seem to me to constitute what I characterized as science in my terms, namely natural sciences, life sciences, and medicine. I then said, and some other things. I think here that there isn't a sharp boundary. So I have very little to say about sociology, you will notice. In another hat, I say things which enormously interest sociologists in my stuff about making up people and so on. That gets terrifically reported in the sociological literature. But that's another hat and another program entirely of mine. History, it again seems to me to be a whole family of activities which just doesn't have enough family resemblances to the things that we officially characterized as the sciences. And that is part of the reason that I said I can just point to the sciences, and is part of my ostensive definition, say I'm not including history. But I've given some reasons for saying not, why not. And another is that there isn't a kind of master historical method which came into being. According to Bernard Williams, there's a master criterion of whether something counts as history at all, is that all the events in your story should be ordered in time. But there's no criterion for what counts as doing history, and it is certainly the case that history of every generation is rewritten. The history, to take the two most famous revolutions, French and American, the history of the French Revolution is rewritten by French historians every generation, and each time bringing out new things. The history of the American Revolution is rewritten by American historians every generation. I won't go so, I don't know enough about Mexican history, but if it's not true of Mexican history, then it ought to be. I mean, that's the nature of history. That's not the nature of the sciences.
Enrique, and then Lorena.
I'm thinking of before your talk. It seems to me that you have a film that there are certain parts of the brain or certain modules which are specialized in different kinds of logic. Inductive logic, deductive logic, and abductive logic. Two short questions. What happened with all the kinds of logic? Modal logic, deductive logic, etc. And if that's the case, which are the research that you have considered in order to make this claim? Thank you very much.
Okay, the claim, there's a whole school of cognitive developmental psychology, and it's an interesting fusion of Chomsky and Piaget. Although Chomsky himself hates Piaget, in fact, the next generation down just merge the same ideas. They think that there's a developmental expression of innate capacity, developmental expression in the manner of Piaget of innate capacities in the manner of Chomsky, and they present I'm open-minded. I'm not going to assert what they do as fact, but they produce arguments which compel many careful readers to think that there are distinct models, distinct modules, is their term, which are domain-specific. They deal just with certain types of reasoning, for deduction, for induction, and particularly is being worked out for induction about plants and animals and so on. I'll mention that in the lecture. And they have very little to say about inference to the best explanation or abduction. They have a lot to say about classification. Now, that's the source. That's what I'm saying. They are the source of what I say is plausible. Maybe not fact, but plausible. Second, about other modes of logic, they are, in my opinion, trivial, in the sense that deductive logic is an investigation of extraordinarily deep properties of whatever it investigates. Modal logic and deontic logic and so on are attempts to take ideas from standard logic and to apply them to other domains. That is also even true of intuitionist logic. And I say this, the first paper which I ever published was a paper in the Journal of Symbolic Logic on modal logic. And at that time, that was the time when Saul Kripke was radically changing modal logic. And the editor of the Journal of Symbolic Logic said kindly at that time, your paper is the only thing which does something different, which does something new, which Kripke didn't implicitly do. So I state this not by way of boasting, but saying I'm not putting down modal logic because I don't know something about modal logic, that's all. It's not something I continue with, and it's partly not something I continue with because I don't think that it is, I don't think that it goes very far. And I can say I voted with my feet. There's a footnote actually in one of Arthur Pryor's big book about time, in which he say there are some amazing results proved by Ian Hacking and his student David Berg in Vancouver, and we refused to publish those because we didn't think they were important. Whereas, so that's what I think about other kinds of logic. I'm sorry to disparage people who engage in them, but I was asked a question I prefer to answer honestly rather than politely.
Thank you. Elena and then Miruna.
My question is about crystallization.
Yes.
And the question is, what kind of process is it? And is there such a thing as abandoning a thought style or style of doing and thinking? Is there such a thing as abandoning that? Because you say once it becomes kind of it becomes universal, then it becomes a style of thinking and doing. But is there such a thing as something, abandoning something like that?
Well, I suggested one possible example of what a possible world in modal logic of what it might have happened. Okay, I mean, it could well, things could just have become much more radicalized at that time. And there was then an enormous rage against reason. There's two questions here, and they're both good, both very important questions. One is, what is crystallization anyway? Well, really, that's just my name for a particular kind of what I think of as mutation, but one which happens within a long-standing, existing history of practices. People, I mean, Crombie in his book has a very, very interesting connection between architectural design and hypothetical modeling. And indeed, the frontispiece for the first volume of his book is from a 13th century, I think, or late 12th, book, which shows God with all the tools of the surveyor, the compass and the plane and so on, designing the world. And Leibniz had the idea that hypothetical modeling is really what he called architectonic reasoning. It is figuring out how the way the architect of the world made things. Now, so Galileo, I say, it all just came together with it all over Europe. Everybody started making these models and taking them seriously and so forth. There was lots of people doing that 200-300 years before, and Crombie always emphasizes the importance of the late Middle Ages. There are lots of people doing somewhat similar things earlier, and in a sense we've always made sort of hypothetical models, but not mathematical ones the way that Crombie did. So something just crystallized seems to me my word. And why I don't use words like mutation and cuckoo or whatever that are established is because they suggest there's no continuity. They go, just go like that. Whereas I want to emphasize there really is continuity. So crystallize, but how that happens, will be very different in each case. That's why I like that exceptional social history provided by Chapin and Schaffer in their book, The Shaping of Deduction in Greek Mathematics. Sorry, I'll explain why I made that statement. Why in that book, Leviathan and the Air Pump, and why I single out Netz's book, The Shaping of Deduction in Greek Mathematics, as a parallel source book for the study of styles of reasoning. I gave that book to Bruno Latour, who I think is supposed to be in Mexico. There's a little trouble over the Atlantic. And he reviewed the book, and the beginning sentence in his book is, "This is the most important contribution to science studies since Schaeffer and Chapin." Schaeffer and Chapin. And I completely agree with that, though for very different reasons. I mean, this is a perfect example of the way in which, when you look at a particular crystallization, you really need the study of a thought style, and that's provided there. It's exemplary. So that's what I want to say about crystallizations. There isn't some general rule, a crystallization happens under such and such conditions. Now, that's one question, and I distinguish it from the other one, can things just stop? Here, there's a difficulty in producing historical examples. One of the ones that was first produced against me was by a man named Barry Allen, who said, look, witchcraft in the late Middle Ages, Renaissance, and even into, alas, the early modern period, was a science, and it had definite rules, and they were set down in a document known as the Malleus Maleficarum, and etc. And it just died out. Why isn't it a sign of scientific thinking and doing? They did a lot of doing, like they burnt people to death, and they did a lot of thinking. The Inquisition had the most elaborate records of court trials, which now only recently have historians of the period or sociologists of the period begun to exploit, because those monstrous judges wrote down every single fact about the women they were going to burn. It went on for years sometimes, these trials. So why wasn't that a science? There's two options here, and I really don't mind which it is. I can say, yes, it is a style of scientific, it's a science with its own style, and that style simply got abandoned after a while. I think there are reasons, I can give reasons in any particular case why there was an abandonment, and give a reason with a story within my own framework, but that would take a little more time now.
Well, I mean, couldn't you say, for example, Aristotle's style of thinking, because Aristotle inaugurated a style of thinking that went on until the 13th century. Couldn't you say, or more, I mean, beyond the 13th century, couldn't you say that that somehow was abandoned somewhere between the 16th and 17th centuries?
I really, I see another side of Aristotle.
Yeah.
I see Aristotle, first of all, as the first to canonize logic, right? And he set out the principles of the first, there's logic everywhere. He was the first person who set out absolute system of rules of logic. His natural histories, his parts of animals and so on, are exemplary of the taxonomic style of reasoning at a certain stage. It's not, something happened to that at the time of Linnaeus, but up until Linnaeus, people really thought in a sort of Aristotelian, or what I should put in footnote here importantly, a Galenic way about how to classify things. So I don't see that as being dropped out, but rather as being crystallized into a slightly different form. Now, it seems to me that here, I can talk about Aristotle. I'm going to avoid the word style for a moment. There are some aspects of Aristotle's thinking. For instance, his reliance on a notion of essences, which I would like to think has absolutely dropped out, were it not for Saul Kripke's reinstallation of essences into the doctrine of natural kinds. But it's just not the case that modern scientists since 16th, 17th century have thought in terms of essences, and Locke's book on human understanding, the third book, what John Stuart Mill, the great novelist, called that immortal third book, it's commonly taken as someone who anticipated Kripke. On the contrary, he trashed Kripke. He trashed by implication Kripke. He trashed the Aristotelian essences and so on. He's called himself a kind of under-laborer for the scientists, the Royal Society and so forth. And here he was sort of underwriting what they had in fact doing. He was giving reasons not to follow that. So certain aspects of Aristotle's thought definitely, except everything comes back, alas, but certain aspects have been largely abandoned, and certainly abandoned in the sciences, but other aspects of Aristotle's thought continued for a lot. I like a phrase of one of my teachers a long time ago, who is English and sort of thought of cricket, who called Aristotle the non-playing captain of the logic team.
Niruna?
Yeah, I'd like to return to one of the questions that I was asked earlier about history, like why history is excluded, but I'd like to do it from a different point of view, because you're saying your answer was that you cannot recognize history while you can recognize the sciences, and I don't know if I want to play devil's advocate or what word you give to it, but although you do have the caveat that you're doing a history of the present, where anachronism, plays a part in recognizing, in the act of recognition of what scientific style of reasoning is. But do we really recognize the sciences? Because you've given examples. I mean, do you recognize the sciences as much as you say you do? Because I do recognize history through the past 2,000 years. Do you recognize, for instance, astrology or astronomy or Paracelsus's alchemy as the sciences? Aren't the sciences much closer in that sense to history than leaving them or excluding them from these categories? Not that I want history to be made into a science. Yeah. I think sciences are a history themselves. So.
Look, I must have misspoken if I gave the impression that I recognize science and I don't recognize history. I didn't mean to say that. I apologize if anyone heard me to say that yourself. What I said was that what I intended to say, well, first of all, of course I recognize history, and I'm very generous in my recognition, I think more generous than some academic historians would like in calling certain kinds of recountings and analyses historical. I just don't, but what makes me call them historical is very different from what makes me call something a science. Basically, there are two things which are clearly important in my recognizing something as a science, as opposed to recognizing it as historical work. And one is simply our institutional practices, which I say are highly contingent. We needn't have developed things that way, but that's the way they have developed, and that has formed. After all, we teach children in school. I mean, we indoctrinate children with this story of the sciences. And I'm not vindicating that. I'm saying it's just a fact about the current, Marshall Solins, the anthropologist, talks about the world system, which indoctrinates people with many things. It's just as true in China as it is in Mexico, that there's a certain class of things which are counted as sciences, and which are planted over there, or wherever it is, I'm not, and significantly kept separate. And it's true that children, where they're in places like Papua New Guinea, where science has been very little propagated, by the time they've gone through, if those ones who've gone through 6 years of education are told that now that may be colonial or whatever it is, but they're told the sciences are these. They know words like biology and so forth. So, I mean, that's a fact. I also think the fact is not completely fortuitous. That is, I think that certain certain styles of scientific thinking and doing have developed over a very, very long period of time, and that they could be thought of as characterizing what the sciences are. And indeed, Richard Rorty wrote a paper called Is Science a Natural Kind? And I once argued, although I don't believe in natural kinds really, there is something that marks out the sciences, namely that they use these group of styles of scientific thinking and reasoning. But I sort of backtracked from that statement implicitly here, saying that no, really I was just being circular, and maybe science, Rorty was absolutely right to say science isn't a natural kind, if that means somehow founded in the nature of things. But it is an important kind of activity grounded in the present nature, the present practices of human beings.
Someone question? ¿Alguien más quiere hacer una pregunta?
Yes. On the ontological disputation that what you stated that you will develop on this time, but I personally think a lot about the disputation that there is today on cosmology and the existence of dark matter. And this comes from two different kinds of, well, not theories, no, on the existence of dark matter or unmodified ways of gravitational theory. And I was wondering if you had thought about this problem, which, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so first, a clarification. When I used the word disputation, I did it deliberately, ironically. What happened in the medieval universities was that people got their doctorate by engaging in a disputation, sitting on a three-legged stool and disputing with the other doctors. And I really wanted to say that those ontological debates, very different from the one you mentioned, are really fit for disputations. They're not scientific controversies or scientific controversies. You mentioned a very important issue, and indeed a controversy, about dark matter. Now, there, of course, I have no specialist knowledge. I do know more about some branches of physics than many philosophers. I know about one better than any other philosopher. But I don't know anything much about the present. I mean, I only know journalism about dark matter. As regards the style of scientific thinking and doing, it seems to be straightforward, the laboratory style. That is, we have a series of hypothetical models of the universe. There are severe problems because they all imply that there's a lot of dark matter which we seem not to be able to observe. And so we can't do the other part of the laboratory style, namely the experimental exploration of looking for the dark matter. Now, although I'll mention one example of that, it is thought, it is conjectured, that maybe some of the results coming out of the Hadron Super Collider in CERN right now will bear on that question. But I can give you an example that we can, it's the kind of thing one can do simple experiments on. It's not so much dark matter, there's just too much mass in the universe. That's the starting point. There's too much mass in the universe to explain by all the stuff we know. I have a friend, Melissa Franklin, who's a physicist at Harvard. Primarily, she designs detectors for particles. But she and a man called Glashow at Harvard, who got a Nobel Prize along with some other people for important work a long time ago, suggested a very simple thing, that maybe a lot of the extra weight around is at the bottom of the ocean. We don't really know what's at the bottom of the ocean. So they built an exceedingly subtle centrifuge centrifuge going around like this. They got some water from as deep as they could get, and they put it in the centrifuge to see if they produced heavier somethings than you get on the surface of the Earth. Now this is a crazy experiment done by very serious people, one of whom had distinguished himself with the Nobel Prize, and the other one whom I think is smarter than him, namely Melissa Franklin. And they thought this was something worth doing. It's a bit like a remark of a son of Charles Darwin's, George Darwin. He says, you should always do foolish experiments once in a while. I try blowing he's English of course, I try blowing the trumpet to tulips in the morning to see if they grow better. And if they did, it would be an amazing discovery. Well, again, with the Franklin glass show experiment, it would have been it. So you can do ordinary small-scale experiments. In other words, I want to say that problem is indeed an extremely difficult open question of physics, which we address in the ways in which, in this combination of experimental exploration and hypothetical modeling, using lots and lots of mathematics, and now using simulations all over the place. I mean, simulations will almost certainly be whatever unlocks there, if anything ever unlocks it. Unless it's a crazy experiment like Frank